Our guest today is Mr. Nicholas Hanley. He's Acting Director for International Relations and Enlargement in the European Commission's Directorate General for Environment. Welcome to India and Delhi.
Thank you.
You've been involved in environment policy for over 30 years and a lot of that in the European Commission. Can you give us a sense of the changes taking place in environment policy over the last decade or so?
Well, I think if we look back over the period which we've been developing environment policy, we started with what we'd call the low-hanging fruits. We were doing the easy things where clearly there was an obvious need for improving air quality, managing water, looking at chemicals, nature and whatever. And the EU has been very successful. The member states understood quite early on that environment, as we say, knows boundaries, and therefore many of the challenges in the European environment needed cooperation between the EU member states, which is why a lot of competence has been given to the EU centrally to come up with common rules and see them implemented, both for environmental quality in its own right, but also as an essential element of the European single market. Product standards for cars, for all sorts of gadgets that we buy and use, have to be good for the environment. Over the last 10 years, we've moved into a phase where we've been looking more at how we integrate environment policy into other policies, be these maritime policies, transport policies, energy, fisheries, agriculture. And increasingly, we've seen very much in the spirit of sustainable development, these policies being greened. So if we take, for example, climate change, a lot of the good work on climate change targets in the EU is now being done within energy policy, where there's increasing focus on energy efficiency and energy conservation and renewables. I can say the same thing in other areas. So we are still moving forward with dedicated environment actions, implementing them and seeing them through, but increasingly a broader emphasis on the role of other parts of public policy and other parts of enterprise to do their part as well.
In a way, you've anticipated my next question. I was going to say that, environment is one of those cross-cutting areas and very often not a sector by itself. It has to work itself through so many other policies, the ones you mentioned. Does this make environment policy and program very difficult, challenging in some way?
I think it is challenging because we're constantly being required to justify what we want to achieve. Far too often, environment policy has been typified as the ball and chain around the emphasis of growth and competitivity, getting in the way of job creation. I think we're having increasingly to demonstrate that we're actually part of that rather than fighting against it.
Yes.
And that's why talking about sustainable development, really understanding environment, economy and social objectives as a package is important. One of the very interesting things we've seen in the last few years is that Europe has gone through a very significant economic crisis, but the few sectors in industry which have done well in that period are what we call the green industry sectors, sectors that are producing new technology which responds to environmental demands and environmental pressures. We've seen significant growth in renewable energies, wind farms, photovoltaics. We've seen increasing growth of industries related to water treatment and the like. So these are positive messages, but it's a constant challenge. As our knowledge of the environment grows, we start to identify new problems. People I've been meeting in Delhi in the last few days have been talking about particulate matter. 25 years ago when I started working on air quality, we were talking about PM10, PM25, PM2.5 didn't even exist. We were not aware of the danger of microparticles. So as our knowledge has become greater, and particularly the knowledge of the health environment impacts of various pollutants and various processes, we've had to readapt the policies, and this has been a challenge for industry to find the technologies to respond to it. A challenge in terms of the transition of making the investments to overcome the problems as well.
Can you give us some examples of effective environment policy from Europe?
I think environment policy in Europe has been very effective in a number of areas. I've talked about water and I've talked about air. I mean, the river quality and the water quality in our aquifers has improved significantly. Obviously more in the original part of the EU. The new countries that joined in 2004 and 2008 are still playing catch up. But if you look at the improvement of river quality in the EU 12 and 15, it's very significant. Air quality as well. I can remember as a child growing up in London, not going to school on days when the smog was so bad because you could hardly see to the other side of this room. Now that's a thing of history. There are still problems. As I say, new problems which have been identified, but we have made very significant progress. And yeah.
Apart from legislating higher standards, what proactively does the European Commission do to improve the environment?
Well, in addition to legislation, there are a number of other instruments which come into play. Obviously, our colleagues in climate change area are using the emissions trading scheme, a market instrument, which is an important component of the overall drive to reduce CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. In the area of DG Environment and Environment Policy, we have a number of other tools as well. For example, we have an eco-label scheme whereby companies can ask for their products to get the eco-label if they're meeting the more searching demands of the higher standards to get an eco-label. And this provides European consumers with the option of buying a product which is of a higher environment standard, be in terms of either its impact on the environment or the impacts related to its production in the first place, depending on the nature of the product. Similarly, we have a scheme for businesses where we encourage businesses to do environmental reporting through the environment management and auditing system, ways of them being able to demonstrate that they actually have a good handle on their footprint on the environment and are committing themselves to manage it and have transition periods of increasing their performance by reduction of water or energy or whatever it might be. The audit shows is there significant impact, and that could be a manufacturing business, a service business, or offices or whatever. It's different modules designed for different kinds of enterprises.
How do you see the relative effectiveness of so-called market-based instruments versus direct interventions?
I think they each have their own place. As I said, the examples I gave you before are examples where market-based type instruments can be shown to be pushing forward. Obviously, eco-labels are only going to be a small proportion of the entire offering of goods, but the companies who want to demonstrate that their goods are better are pushing us to revise the eco-labels regularly so that the quality standards get more demanding. And that's, if you like, an experimental form which shows how we could raise the basic levels as well. So the two things are not independent, they have a relationship. I think there are other areas where we have still some way to go. Certainly in Europe we still have a lot of interest from consumers about better environmental standards, and a lot of companies are seeking to benefit from that. Not always are their claims as credible as what they make out. So some kind of regulation of environmental claims is an area of some importance.
Protecting biodiversity is one of those areas where I think people are not very clear about exactly what the benefits are and how governments should promote conservation of biodiversity.
Right.
Could you tell us what the EU is doing about this?
Well, biodiversity, the reasons for protecting it are varied, and some of them are emotional. We have great feelings, particularly in the UK where I come from. We are bird lovers. We have an NGO with 2 million members, the Royal Society of Protection of Birds. So at one level, it's an emotional issue, the way you have an emotion about elephants in India, for example, tigers and whatever. They are icons to a certain extent, but behind that, biodiversity is not just emotion. Biodiversity are the natural systems of our world, and those natural systems have a value more than just the enjoyment we get from seeing wildlife. Whether we're talking about the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the natural systems are providing to us what we call ecosystem services. Natural habitats are filtering water, they're supplying water. If you destroy them, you will have to replace the forest which filters the water for you by a treatment plant. So I think we have to understand more about this relationship we have with the natural world and what it's doing for us and the implications of doing away from it. Far too often we only find out the implications when we've destroyed nature, and then we're having floods because there isn't a forest, there isn't a floodplain anymore where the water would normally be held back or would go. These are some of the examples where we need to get away. I'm not saying the emotional thing isn't important. It has an economic value to a certain extent itself, because an awful lot of tourism is revolved around people wanting to go and enjoy nature and in a non-exploitative way, if you like. But that's one element. But the economics of our relationship with natural systems is perhaps not as well understood as it has been. We have been pushing something called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, which was a major initiative which was actually run by Pavan Sukhdev, who was an Indian banker, who was the person who was leading that initiative, trying to demonstrate better knowledge of this relationship. And I think that's starting to make some headway, both in Europe and more widely, something called natural capital accounting, where we understand the economic value of natural systems and the implications of not looking after them well and accounting better for what they're providing for us. So that's some of the reasons why we should be looking after biodiversity. In Europe, we're doing this in a number of ways. We're doing it by dedicated regulation. We have nature laws, both a Birds Directive and Habitats Directive, but we also have, under the Impact Assessment Directive, we have to look, when there's big developments, what their impacts will be. So in the planning of new projects, new investments, infrastructures and whatever, we are conscious of what the impact is going to be, so we can at best choose options which have less or no impact, or at worst find ways of mitigating or compensating for the damage which is unavoidable. So that's one side of it. Clearly, the EU has policies both on agriculture and maritime and fisheries, and the integration that I was talking about earlier on has increased enormously. A significant component of the agricultural funding we're giving to farmers now is agri-environment funding, where some of the subsidies we're giving them is to encourage them to take part in agriculture which is more respectful of the environment, protecting the environment rather than damaging it. And we've seen in the maritime policy, fisheries policy in particular, increasing awareness that it's not a question of looking after the marine environment or catching fish. If you don't look after the marine environment, you won't have any fish to catch. And therefore, that balance has to be achieved. And that balance is all about ensuring that the seas are not polluted, ensuring you don't catch too many fish such that there's not a breeding stock left to replenish the stocks. So these sorts of things are gradually being better managed in Europe. We've gone through decades of overfishing and collapse of fishing stocks, and even the fishing community themselves, which is very reticent about stricter quotas, has come around to the understanding, at the most part, not all of them, but that their long-term survival as an industry requires a more science-based knowledge of how conservation management can be well managed.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Natura 2000 program?
Well, the Natura 2000 programme was something which I personally had a lot to do with, because I was 4 or 5 years head of that particular unit when we were putting it in place. The concept is based on the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directives, where one component of the protection is the designation of areas of most importance for the species of plants and animals and habitats most at risk in Europe. And so between 2000, starting in 2000 and moving onwards, we've been progressively designating the important areas across the member states. So today, some 18% of the territory of the EU is designated to be protected. This doesn't mean to say it can't be used, because a lot of this land is farmland or private land, forestry and whatever, but that it should be managed in a way which helps to protect the important nature values that they represent. So the agri-environment measures, for example, I talked about, are often used on farmland, which is Natura 2000 land, to ensure that there is a continuation of traditional methods of farming which had created the nature value which we identify today. So in mountains we have mountain hay meadows where we cut the hay, but we cut it late in the summer so that the plants have been able to flower and the insects benefit from them. Economically, this has somewhat declined because people don't want to climb mountains to cut hay anymore. So many of those areas have been abandoned because it's no longer economic. So the agri-environment measure provides a subsidy to encourage the continuation of that form of management. That's just one example. But Natura 2000 now is probably internationally the most scientifically based network of protection areas. It's a network designed to ensure, as best as we can, a real protection of the birds and animals and plant species, which we have recognised through various scientific studies and whatever, as the most critically threatened and valuable in Europe.
Another area which is becoming more and more important even in India is chemicals, pesticides, man-made chemicals, plastics. How does Europe regulate the production and use of chemicals?
Well,
especially from the health point of view.
Right. Well, obviously the motivation for regulating chemicals is very much related to health impacts and impacts on the wider environment. Traditionally, we've approached this in two ways. We regulate the industrial facilities which are producing chemicals under legislation on industrial installations, so their air emissions, their water emissions, their solid waste emissions are controlled through directives on industrial pollution prevention and control. But when it comes to chemicals for use, we have had traditionally a two-phase thing. One was existing chemicals, the other one was new chemicals. So if you were bringing a new chemical onto the market, there was a very rigid screening process. You had to demonstrate this new chemical you wanted to market and use was safe before it could be authorised. Until a few years ago, everything which had been on the market before that time was called an existing chemical, and it was assumed that it was good. Clearly, as our knowledge has grown, it's become quite clear that a lot of those chemicals were not particularly good. And therefore, there was a long debate about how we should review the safety of existing chemicals, and we were talking about tens of thousands of different products, because in the lives we live, the products we use, be it food, be it all sorts of products, tens of thousands of chemicals being used. And after a very long period of reflection and debate, a long period of discussion in the Council, the Parliament and Commission, we introduced new legislation which basically required that all of existing chemicals should be reviewed, and that it should be registered, evaluated, assessed, and if necessary, some of them identified to be a particular health hazard, whether it's cancer-generous or other type things, their current automatic authorization of existing chemicals taken away. Now, this was extremely sensitive because it required the chemicals industry to accept that the onus of proof for an existing chemical being nasty was moved from the Commission, public authorities, who previously, in order to get a chemical taken off the market, had themselves to find the evidence to prove that it wasn't good, to saying to industry, well, over a period of time, we're going to ask you to register all of your chemicals and provide us with yourself the information to prove that they are safe.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge enterprise, and it has taken time. It is still moving forward. It's involved the creation of a chemicals agency which is based in Helsinki with many hundreds of staff, because going through all of these chemicals and looking scientifically at the evidence. Chemicals industry itself was divided because many of the more responsible chemical companies knew that some of the chemicals on the market were not good. But their message was, well, look, other people are selling them, and if we take them off ourselves because we're responsible, we're losing a market advantage if an alternative chemical is more expensive. So in the end, the chemical industry has come around to it. It took a long time, and it is taking time. Not too many chemicals have been taken out of the market just yet. In some cases, there are chemicals we know there is of concern, but we're having to allow them to stay on the market because they are providing for essential services, be it in terms of agricultural pesticides or herbicides, or be it in healthcare or whatever. But they're recognised as chemicals which we should be looking positively for alternatives which will be less toxic. Right. So this is part of the pattern.
Just as a matter of interest, would the results of all this testing be available to developing countries who have not gone through this cycle?
Well, developing countries are involved because the REACH process and the chemicals are an essential part of the single market. This legislation is environmentally or health related, but if an Indian company wants to sell a product in Europe, it has to be able to certify that none of the chemicals involved in that product's production have been banned on the European market.
Right.
So quite a lot of developing countries have been looking at REACH and looking to be associated with it, or to have parallel processes of their own to ensure that they are in compliance. I mean, certainly I know, I'm not sure personally the situation in India, but I know in Korea, which does market an awful lot of manufactured products in Europe, the Korean administration has a sort of Korea REACH type approach.
Right.
Because they're very keen to ensure that everything they produce, be it cars, be it radios, be it any kind of thing, is something which will have no difficulty being accepted for import into the European market.
Moving from chemicals to sort of end-of-life issues such as waste, this is a big problem, an increasing problem in countries like India, where the population is growing, it's urbanizing, it's industrializing, and waste has been a very difficult problem to handle. Could you give us an insight into what Europe is doing to tackle waste?
Okay, well, we have a number of strategies on waste. I mean, Europe, maybe a few decades ahead of India, has gone through a process whereby we are generating more and more waste. I can remember as a child going shopping with my mother, and we would buy biscuits in Sainsbury's, and they would put it in a paper bag for you, and they would take it out of a tin and sell it to you. That's a thing of the past. So an awful lot more waste is generated by the way in which we consume things.
Packaging, yes.
Packaging waste. So the European approaches on waste addresses a number of things. It addresses the generation of waste in the first place, and the other end deals with the management of waste when it's created. So we do have approaches on packaging waste where we are putting pressure on manufacturers to reduce the amount of packaging, and requirements for manufacturing systems and retailing systems to ensure that packaging is recycled back. So if you'll see cardboard boxes and whatever, that system is in place, packaging waste. In other areas, we're looking at the question of how we manage waste, and we have in the EU something called the waste hierarchy. And at the top of the waste hierarchy is that, in fact, we don't generate waste at all, that we reuse or recycle. This is the ultimate goal of the circular economy, that things are not thrown in holes in the ground or not burnt. But we go down these steps in the hierarchy, so reuse, recycle. If we have to get rid of waste, we at least recover the energy. So incineration with energy recovery, incineration without, and then at the bottom of the scale is landfill. We have, for all of those different processes, regulatory frameworks. Even for landfill, we have a landfill regulation which requires that landfills have proper systems for recovering the seepage waters going to sewage treatment works rather than polluting aquifers. We have systems where there is the capturing of methane, or indeed a method of putting the waste in the first place to reduce methane production. A whole range of issues like that. Now, some of those things have made landfill more expensive, so other options of waste management become more important. Member states have, in some cases, landfill taxes to try and reduce landfill as part of the component. Our objective certainly is to see very rapidly a decline in landfill. As I said, in the same way with air and water, we have different situations across Europe between countries in advance. So if we look at landfill, countries like Netherlands, countries like Germany, countries like Denmark are well ahead. Landfill is a very, very small part of their waste management today. New countries have joined more recently, Romania and Bulgaria. They're still very much into landfill. This change doesn't happen overnight. We place a great emphasis on each member state, each municipality having a waste management plan where they are doing forward planning and setting their objectives, and therefore making decisions on their investment on waste infrastructure with a view to targets of where they want to go. And we're looking at the moment to review those and move forward. We support many of those things with specific bits of legislation, and I'll give you two examples. We produced a number of years ago a directive called the End-of-Life Vehicle Directive. We had a problem with abandoned cars and abandoned tyres, and huge chunks of the countryside covered with carcasses of tyres, carcasses of cars where the waste industry was selectively stripping bits off them and leaving the rest to go. And we introduced an End-of-Life Vehicles Directive which placed a degree of responsibility on the producer to ensure two things. That they were involved in ensuring that cars got recycled, and that in order to facilitate that recycling, they were designing cars in a way that recycling became more easily. Mm-hmm. If you take an old car, 30, 40-year-old car, it is a complex mixture of plastics, glass, leather, metals of different kinds. Some of those involving substances which are toxic and therefore potentially polluting reuse. Rather a difficult animal to recycle. Mm. If, however, you're the car manufacturer and you know that in 10 years' time this car's coming back to you, or 15 years' time, and you are going to have some degree of responsibility of ensuring it's recycled, then you will design it in a way to facilitate recycling. So that's part of the, shall we say, eco-design. And one of the key elements related to that was both for cars but also for electronics, where we've now got a similar end-of-life electronic waste directive, ensuring that when I buy a new mobile phone I can hand in the old one in the shop, and the shop has to put that into a supply chain of make sure it gets recycled. One of the things, particularly in the electronics business, which was inhibiting recycling, was that a lot of components had toxic chemicals in it, mercury, cadmium, other things. So in addition to having a directive on end-of-life electronic waste, ensuring there is a chain of custody, ensuring things get recycled. We have another directive called Restriction of Hazardous Substances, which says that you cannot put these substances into a mobile phone, because when we're looking to recycle and reuse the material, we don't want that material polluted by these substances. So these kinds of things as well have also been picked up by many of the countries like Korea, like Japan, who are looking to sell electronic components, particularly to Europe. And so what we've done in Europe for Europe's own interest has in some cases started to become, shall we say, a global standard or an approach which is picked up. So we have these specific things for particular waste streams which are big and important, but we have a broader structure. And at the moment, as I say, we're reviewing all of this. The Commission will be coming up towards the end of this year with a new package called the Circular Economy Package. And the philosophy is a circular economy, because not only dealing with waste by throwing it holes in the ground is causing environment problems, it is also losing valued resources, which as our population grows and as many resources become more limiting, we've discovered that we should have been using these things. Now, we can't wait until the market establishes the right price so that it makes sense to do it, because the complexities of waste recycling involve the necessity for local authorities who do most of the waste collection to have a relationship with businesses who are going to take this material and put it back into waste streams. So there are very good examples now in Europe and even in Brussels where I live. They've gone from 20 years ago recycling virtually nothing to now recycling 70 or 80% of municipal waste, which is selectively collected and then goes to treatment plants where different components are sorted out, and they have relationships with businesses that will take that component of the waste and will put it back into a manufacturing cycle. But it's something which requires that kind of relationship. It's not easy. It doesn't happen overnight, and it takes time to build up. As I say, 15 years ago, waste recycling in Brussels were very minor, but over a period of 10, 15 years, it's increased significantly.
Right. You are working with many countries as head of in international cooperation. Have you worked with any country specifically in the area of helping them to resolve classic environment versus growth or environment versus jobs kind of paradoxes or conflicts?
Well, as I said in some of my comments earlier on, these paradoxes are there in Europe as well. We have to demonstrate how what we're trying to do for the environment is positive for growth and competitivity. Clearly, there is a timescale thing here. Many of the problems of pollution of the environment are because people are not looking very far into the future. You get rid of the waste into the environment today, and downstream somebody else picks up the cost, and it's an easy short-term solution, but in the long term it's a cost to society as a whole. Many of the things we've done in Europe have tackled that. Many of the programs we have with, for example, our neighbouring countries, we have strong relationships with Eastern Europe, strong relationships with the Southern Mediterranean, where we share environments, the Mediterranean Sea, where we are helping them through technical assistance programs, through funding programs with investments. We're also, where we're working with development aid, seeking to see environment a component of what is being done with our partner countries, but obviously not dictating to them what they should be doing, helping them where we can. With a broader range of countries, which are countries like your own, which are emerging economies, the relationship is evolving, a relationship which is moving on from what previously was some forms of development assistance financially to a relationship, a partnership, where we still are willing and able to help by sharing our experiences, showing what we've achieved and the methods we've used, be these technologies, be these administrative measures or whatever, how you can tackle them. So be it yourselves in India, be it China, be it Brazil, Mexico, with some of these big economies, we have regular dialogues and exchange programs where they're asking specifically for our assistance on particular issues.
I understand the EU is about to involve itself in assisting the government's one of its flagship initiatives, which is the Ganga Action Plan. Could you tell us a little more about what you contemplate?
Well, we're having discussions with colleagues in the administration, the water ministry and the people who have been given specifically responsibility by the Prime Minister's office to do this. Obviously the Ganges is symbolically very important, and I think when we look at the commitments made by your new Prime Minister, I think it's very reassuring to the outside world to see that an environment target is one of the high-level targets which he's setting. As I say, we've gone through many decades of water policy and implementation in Europe. We've learnt lessons, we've made mistakes, but we've made increasingly good progress. We've now got a framework where we are focusing on river basins and looking at them in their entirety. And this approach is absolutely the right approach if you're going to address the multiple problems of the Ganges. The experience in Europe, whether it's on the River Rhine or the Danube or other rivers where we've had similar kinds of programs, is that you need to bring a lot of actors together, because the problems of these big rivers are a combination of water quality issues and water quantity issues. Pressures for water use by farming, by industry, by towns and cities, the need to protect water where it's protecting important nature habitats, be they rivers or marshes or lakes. How do you reconcile the conflicting demands of all of these things? And then the problem with the rivers being used as open sewers as a way of getting rid of solid or liquid waste, and the regulation of all of that. Our experience in Europe has shown that many of our rivers cross boundaries, and therefore we need 5 or 6 countries to sit together around. The Rhine Commission historically was the way that was done. I don't know how many of the Indian states the Ganges flows through from its sources in the Himalayas to where it flows out into the sea, probably quite a lot, and cooperation also with Bangladesh where it's going to its ultimate estuary. So these are very difficult problems, and I don't think we would ever pretend to anybody that we've got them all solved in Europe. We've made good progress, more in certain countries than others. We need to put different actors and different administrations together. We need to responsibilise business and start off by fully understanding the nature of the problem. I mean, you can't manage a problem until you've actually got a grip with it. Now, I know you've been talking about the Ganges for decades. I'm sure there are reports on the Ganges which have identified the nature of its problems. Our experience would show probably it's going to take you years and years. I think anybody with any knowledge of the Ganges would know that the scale of the investments required and the amount of technology and the amount of effort required is going to be enormous. So what's good about the Prime Minister's engagement, it's setting a target, it's signalling to everybody this is important. And I think the EU, that still sees itself as a strong partner with India, it is happy to offer what we can to India in terms of our experience, our technology, our expertise, to help you addressing and moving forward with this very ambitious program.
You mentioned technology. Has the European Union promoted research and development in the water sector, and have there been significant benefits?
Well, there are 2 ways we've done that. Obviously, our legislation setting ambitious targets for water pollution control and improving water standards has provided the incentive to industry to go out and find more effective technologies. More cost effective, but more actually technically effective as well. So we have now in Europe a situation where between water companies and water technology suppliers, we have some 70,000 businesses in the water business one way or another, and that represents about 500,000 jobs. Now, because we have been probably globally one of the most demanding in terms of our standards, this has forced our industry to move forward, which means that today in the water technology sector, European companies have a first mover advantage. They've had to go there, and they now have technologies which they are starting to sell all over the world, because what they had to do by obligation in Europe is now giving them the technologies that other parts of the world are looking for. So clearly there will be opportunities for Indian companies to partnership with European companies in terms of ways of ensuring those technologies and that expertise is applied well to the challenges of the Ganges. And this is a component where this is enlightened self-interest, but it's a positive thing. Clearly, I know that in India you're keen to see a lot of the technology you're using as homegrown, or at least home manufactured, but this is opportunities where European companies can partner with Indian companies in ensuring that the best technologies are the most cost-effective technologies, and the costs are enormous. So rather than reinventing the wheel, it's important to learn from those who've actually gone through the process already and avoid spending money in the wrong way.
Mr. Hanley, you've had some meetings with the government, I understand. Could you tell us the outcome of your discussions?
Well, in the course of the sessions I was taking part in the Confederation of Indian Industries Sustainability Forums Summit, I met with a number of people from different administrations, so there have been some side meetings. We've met today with colleagues from the Energy Efficiency Administration. I'm meeting tomorrow with the Secretary in the Water Ministry, and that discussion will be trying to move forward a little bit further the modalities for European Union involvement in this Ganges programme. And we have planned for November an EU-India water forum, and our Director General will be coming from Brussels to participate in that. And we're inviting experts from another number of member states, because the EU is not just the Commission, the EU is the member states, and we try and work together and call upon the expertise which is down there on the ground level, the people on the day-to-day basis who are managing water or air quality. These very often are the people that we need to mobilise to have the direct contact with colleagues in other countries. And we're organising, for example, a study visit for a number of officials from the Water Ministry and related administrations to come to Europe to see on the ground how our approaches are being managed in a number of the member states.
Mr. Hanley, you've covered an awful lot of territory in a relatively short time. It's been very interesting. Thanks very much.
Thank you.